Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started this evening. We're talking tonight about hiring during COVID-19, and we've got three great people here from Beyond Rewards HR. Beyond Rewards HR is a company that a couple of our members are using already, and they're really happy with the services they're getting. So we thought we'd ask them to join us this evening and tell us a little bit more about some of the things we need to consider if we are looking for staff during this time. So we've got Pat with us. If Pat, you can give us a wave there. Pat, Krysta, and Lynn. Hi. And they're going to start right into this presentation. I believe I have unmuted you all, and you can ask questions in the chat room. We're going to try and keep questions. It's set up as basically two presentations. So maybe if you can post your questions whatever you want, but the Beyond Rewards group will answer them about halfway through and then look at some questions at the end again. So at this point, and if you are, I've allowed you to talk, but if you could keep your screen muted until you want to share something with us, that would be great. So at this point, I'm going to hand things over to Lynn and get us started here. Welcome.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. Krysta is going to do the first part of the presentation, talking to you about recruitment. Krysta does a lot of our recruitment for our clients, and so I'll leave it with her.
Thank you, Lynn.
You're welcome.
Well, good evening, everybody. So we're going to start with how to conduct safe interviews amid the COVID-19. So the HR answer for that would be, now that the stay-at-home order has officially gone into effect across the region, virtual interactions are being added as necessary steps in lieu and prior to inviting candidates to an in-person job interview. So more people are starting to do virtual interviews, where it has been done all along, but now it's becoming the norm. So at this time, it's important to limit the need for candidates to be on site for in-person interviews. We provide recommendations on conducting virtual interviews and best practices to follow when necessary to have the candidate on site. So that's what we're going to go through a little bit here. So phone interviews. If it's not already normal practice for you to conduct phone interviews as your initial step in qualifying candidates prior to bringing them in for an interview, now is the time to start doing that. The phone interview can be used to qualify candidates for high-level fit for experience, pay expectations, availability for specific work schedules, and location. I always enjoy doing phone interviews first with candidates, because then you get a feel for their personality a little bit, how they conduct themselves on the phone. But now it's becoming something that you're going to have to do right off the bat. So the next would be virtual video interviews. So if you do not have the capacity to conduct a high volume of phone interviews, an effective and efficient option can be a virtual one. So one-way video interviews, virtual interviews, platforms that can allow you to screen candidates 24/7. As an added bonus, candidates can complete the interview at their convenience. So sometimes we can send interview questions to a candidate, they video themselves, and then they send their responses back to you in a video, so you can see them answering the questions that way. So live video interviews, so that would be something like Zoom that we're using now. You can use Amazon Chime, Google Hangouts, FaceTime, and many different platforms. This is a great way to include decision makers in your organization. So if you have one person that does the hiring, but there's another step that you've usually taken to have a second person in that interview, now all of you can do the interviews together. So then you can also choose the platform that's going to work best for you. So for example, Zoom, you can record the interview as well, which is very handy. So preparing for video interviews, preparing interviewers. So although the steps for preparing for video interviews, good basic interviewing preps still applies. So you want all interviewers should still review the job description and the resume. So you still want to go through that process of posting the job, reviewing your job description before posting, and then reviewing all the candidates' resume, having prepared interview questions. And one thing that you need to keep in mind when interviewing for one position is you have to have the exact same interview questions for every candidate, and follow the shared agenda for the interview. So you want to make sure that you follow the same agenda for each interview. So what different is the need to make sure that all interviews have access to video. So you want to make sure that each applicant has access to specific video. Do they have Zoom? Can they Zoom call you? You want to make sure of all that and not screen anybody out because they don't have access to this technology. You would have to find another way, whether it's by phone interview, would be a good way to do that, or email. We recommend testing this prior to the interview. So you want to, like I said, make sure that they have access to these technologies, and then asking them to make sure that they work prior to having that face-to-face interview with you. Okay, so preparing candidates. So prior to the interview, you should communicate with the candidates to let them know you'll be conducting video interview and explain how to access the video platform. So will you be emailing them the link to the platform, telling them over the phone, putting it in through Indeed? You need to make sure that that's well communicated to them. You should ensure that they have access to the device, like I said, in the platform. And again, provide them with the opportunity to test that software out. Offer the same suggestions that you shared with your interviewees to find a quiet, well-lit room, and access to their camera and microphone to ensure that they can hear you and you can hear them. And set the stage for what to expect in the interview, including start time, expected length, how to provide a list, the list of interviews for the job titles. So you want to make sure that you ask them to be prepared to give you references during this time, and allow the candidates to ask questions in advance of their interview to alleviate any concerns that they have, as this may be new to them. So conducting safe on-site interviews. When you have a virtual vetting candidates as much as possible down to only those who are highly qualified. So in any interview process, you need to keep a matrix of each candidate that's applied for the job you have posted, and the qualifications you expect from this person, and why or why not they didn't meet those expectations from you. So you needed to do this prior to COVID-19. So now you want to make sure that you're following that process and only picking people that are highly qualified for the position, so that you're not having to do so many virtual interviews. And then again, you don't want to have so many on-site interviews after you've done the virtual interview. So you want to try to limit that down as much as possible. So have provided suggestions. Oh, sorry, my slides are moving here on me. That provide safe practices to ensure the safety of the candidates and interviewers, and we'll get to those in the following slides. So setting clear expectations. Be sure to clearly set expectations and provide specific day of interview instructions for candidates and interviewers. before the on-site interview. These instructions, where to park, have spaces identified specifically for your visitor to use, where to enter the building, if possible, identify specific entrance to be used only for visitors, instructions on who to call and reschedule if they are not feeling well. Maintaining social distancing, so adhering to all social physical distancing guidelines as outlined by public health and your provincial and federal governments, as well as your local municipality. Some suggestions include avoid close contact, ensure that you have interview space where you can maintain 6 feet of separation between each person involved, wash your hands properly, and have hand sanitizer available. Although this is likely breaks your normal protocol, do not shake hands. Like, you can lighten the mood and consider something fun like air high-fiving or air fist pumping people have been doing. Clean and disinfect frequently touched surfaces. This includes tables, doorknobs, light switches, countertops, desks, phones, and keyboards, and making sure you're doing this after each visitor has left as well. Health screen prior to interview. So you cannot ask in the initial interview when you're doing a video interview any of the COVID-19 questions. Before you get to the on-site interview, there are some questions you can ask. So on the day of the interview, yet well in advance of this intended start time and expected arrival of the participants, you call all the participants, candidates, and interviewers to screen for potentially ill individuals by asking these questions. Have you recently traveled to an area with known local spread of COVID-19? Have you come into contact 6 feet with someone who has confirmed COVID-19 diagnosis in the last 14 days? Are you experiencing any COVID-19 symptoms identified by public health? And if they answered yes to any of the above, the interview should be postponed. So conducting safe on-site interviews continued. So health screen on-site. So putting in place processes to check the wellness of candidates and the interviewers when they arrive. So questionnaires, even temperature checks. Postpone the interview immediately if the candidate's temperature is 100 degrees or higher. If you only have a single interviewer and they have a fever, you will need to postpone the interview. So if you have multiple interviewers and one registers a fever, determine whether the interview can proceed without them. So postponing when sick. Hopefully it goes without saying that you will need to postpone the interview if the candidate or essential interviewers are experiencing any symptoms of COVID-19. Given the severity of this pandemic, this is not a moment to take any unnecessary risks. We recognize that it's very challenging to conduct efficient and effective interviews for those in demand essential positions that are in need to continue during the crisis. Hopefully these tips and best practices will help you to still successfully identify and hire the best candidate to meet your hiring needs. So Lynn, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, so there's a couple more slides before we'll stop for questions. Interview questions that can be asked during COVID-19 phase 1. So during your first initial phase of virtual interviewing, you may only ask your normal interview questions and use your techniques to evaluate potential employees. You can ask them about health and safety and use of PPE. So you can ask them what experience they have with personal protective equipment, what health and safety training they have they had a fit test? So have they, in regards to using the face masks, have they been trained to use the face masks? Have they had the proper fit testing to make sure that the masks fit them properly and they know how to put them on? Things you cannot ask in the first initial phase is anything to do with COVID-19. that would fall under human rights, and if they are not hired, can come back to you in the form of a complaint to the Human Rights Board. So you don't want to ask them whether they have been sick or, excuse me, if they have come in contact with anyone. You don't want to ask any of those questions. You can ask, that Krysta mentioned, after they've been offered the job. And the reason for that is they may assume that they did not get the job because of that, and they could take you to human rights based on not getting the job based on discrimination. So questions that can be asked continued. If you have the need to do an in-house interview, then the questions about COVID-19 can be asked, as Krysta said. Or if they have been hired and before they start in your facility, you as the new employer can ask if they have been in contact with someone, or if they have COVID-19, or if they have traveled, but once again, only after the offer of employment or in-house interview has been done. So when they're coming in for the in-house interview, if you're doing that, then you can ask for protection for yourself, your employees, and the individuals coming in. If you're only doing online screening, videos, and you're hiring it that way without bringing them on site, then you can't ask them any of those questions until you offer them the job and they're coming into the workplace. The new employee will have to be aware of the COVID-19 policies and procedures before they start. They will have to know about social distancing and the use of PPE that you will be requiring them to use in the workplace. So before we go into the onboarding, I'm going to put it forward if you have any questions about the interview process for Krysta and myself. We can always catch up at the end as well on that. So going forward, the onboarding process. So, oh, sorry, you have a question? One of the off-ramps I usually use when screening candidates is their ability to follow direction and willingness to take initiative to ask questions if they need support. Wondering your thoughts on that when it comes to inviting them to an interview online or in person. I'm hearing what you're saying as giving as much information as possible in the invite, and I'm wondering if that is personal preference or requirement. I usually give fairly thorough instructions, but would not go into detail about Zoom. I would encourage them to reach out if they have specific questions. And then if they did not ask questions and were not able to show up, that to me is a sign they did not initiate. Is that okay? Krysta, you're going to input as well. It really, I mean, the detail is more about, that we're talking about, is about the link to the Zoom, the technology, if it's not Zoom, the technology you're using, how to test their system to make sure that it works. Those are typical things that are provided with a Zoom when you're copying and pasting it into the invite. Other instructions, if they're having difficulty, yes, I would encourage that they reach out and ask those questions, and that they have tested the Zoom prior to, and the link they have prior to the interview to ensure that it is working. And you can do that to see if the link is working, because you'll be sitting there waiting to go into the room. So again, I would recommend that you do what you feel comfortable doing. If you find that that helps you to analyze the candidate as to how they're going to work in your environment, then by all means continue to do that.
Okay, Lynn.
Yep.
Under the question and answers, there was another question.
Oh, is there?
Will PPEs be required for sure on farm for employees and customers? And that was under question and answers at the bottom.
Okay. Okay, so will PPE be required? Yeah, the Ministry of Labor, and other inspectors are starting to go around as of Monday to workplaces to identify if proper PPE is being used and if proper policies, procedures, and protocols are in place. It's going to, right now, it's very difficult to get medical PPE because of the shortages. There are places, and I will provide Kathy with a link to a great resource for masks that one of our clients actually gets for her healthcare staff, but they are washable. So if you buy 2 per person, it actually works out to be a lot cheaper because you're not constantly supplying the masks. And they can take them home and wash them. So that may be a cheaper solution for you. And like I said, they are fabric ones, so they can be washed. The other alternative as well are for gloves and things that you probably provide that already. But the idea is to do a risk assessment on their potential for coming in contact with it and assess based on that. So when you're thinking about the distancing as well, if they can't be 6 feet apart, and that 6 feet is 6 square feet, so 36 square feet per person is the amount of space you have to allow. If that can't happen, that's when you need to provide the proper PPE. And when they're working in the fields, they won't be able to have dividers between them. So you're going to have to make sure that social distancing is there. And one of the things you have to have, and the ministry will be looking for, is to make sure that you have somebody designated as a marshal to be able to ensure that everybody is staying the 6 feet apart. And like I said, that's 6 square feet. So that's something you'll have to think about when you're positioning where people are working. If it's in a farm store, that 36 square feet is required for your staff and any customers coming into the store. And yes, proper PPE would have to be provided. In one of our clients' facilities, one of our farm stores, they put up the plexiglass at the till for the employees. And I'm going to use this as an example. Let's say your farm store is 400 square feet. In a 400 square foot facility, you would be allowed to have, you divide 36 square feet into that, you get 11. So that would be 11 people. I would potentially knock that down because you also have equipment and counters and everything in there. So the amount of actual floor space that you have, less any staff you have in there, would be a lot less than the 11. So in a 400 square foot store, you would probably be allowed to have 5 customers at a time in the store with the 36 square foot rule. So, and if you can't provide that 36 square feet to provide that space for your employees, that's when you have to have all that PPE in place. And that's not only your gloves and your masks, it could be, like I said, the plexiglass in front of the till, etc. Are there any other questions, Pat?
No, that's it.
Okay. We're going to talk a little bit more about the health and safety side of things that you have to have in place as well. So, so the benefits of online onboarding and training for new staff. The virtual process of onboarding and training new hires is really a great idea, even prior to the pandemic, because it allows for ease of process, and there's a lot more pros than cons to having an online system, and we'll get into a lot more of that. But the norm that we're in right now, which is very different from what we're used to, is going to be, as we have here, the new normal for some time. We're not going to be out of the woods on this anytime soon. It's going to be at least the next year that we're going through this process. So we may as well get comfortable with some of these new changes that are being put in place and take advantage of some of the benefits that are going to go along with that. So, oh, my slide isn't changing. Just 1 second. There we go. So onboarding the new hire can take place.
I think you just skipped a few, Lynn.
Oh, did I?
Yes.
Oh.
One more back right there. Yeah. No, you read
that's
that
where
one.
I left off. Okay, thank you, Pat.
No problem.
So once you have your online onboarding and new employee training system in place, it becomes a simple, repeatable process, consistent across all new hires. With most online training processes, you can build in testing and everything else so that multiple team members can be doing the training at the same time. And it doesn't conflict with other schedules and things happening. And sometimes you can even have your new hires doing that training before they come into the organization their very first day. So with doing the training online, they're coming into work understanding your new procedures without having to take the time to go and sit somewhere and do them when they come into the workplace. And you're not printing out a lot of documents and everything that they're going to end up throwing in the garbage or saying they never received. The other thing is, by creating the online training, it is very standardized. So instead of having somebody sit there and do the training face to face, everyone's getting the same training, everyone's getting the same message. It saves a lot of money on having trainers come in and having other employees pulled away from their job to do the training. So it's a very cost-effective way of doing the training. The initial output for having the training develop well outweighs the other costs that you normally would have put into that training, thinking about the cost of the employee who's doing the training for you, cost of materials, and everything else. And usually that training can be updated fairly easily when there are government changes. Onboarding and new hire training can take place anytime that is convenient based on your needs and your new employee's schedule. And one thing nice about this, like I said, if they can do it prior to their starting, they can sit down at their own time without feeling pressured or stressed. Some people have a very hard time sitting down in a classroom style and doing tests or doing things in the workplace. If they have a chance to do it online, then they can do it when it's most comfortable for them, and they can not only fit it into their schedule, but it fits into yours as well, because it's not disrupting your day at work. Online training offers perks that face-to-face training cannot replicate. For example, gamification and other interactive content that increases the employee's engagement and retention of important information. So you can build all of those things into the training. Most of they call them LMS, learning management software platforms, are very interactive and provide a very robust training program for your employees. Online onboarding and training are less stressful for new employees. New hires can learn at their own pace. If they don't understand something, they're free to repeat that part of the training rather than feeling self-conscious about asking questions in a crowded orientation or training session. And I've found that in doing my training, my face-to-face training, that quite often employees won't ask questions where they should because they don't want to be centered out. Where if they're doing the online training and they have a question, they are more apt on their own to reach out and ask a question where they're not going to be in a classroom and get the information that they need. Most employer-based online training systems provide measurable results and reporting through quizzes and testing, so you can determine the areas where your new hire will excel and which areas where they may need more training. So one thing about the online training, they do typically have, or you can have training modules, quizzes built into them, and have those test results sent to you, so that once the employee has completed that training, that they, you know whether they've passed or failed, and whether you need to sit down with them one-on-one. So conclusion about the online and onboarding for new hires. There's no doubt most companies aren't doing business as usual these days, but that doesn't have to be a bad thing. With today's video conferencing, project management, messaging, and e-learning platforms and other online tools, employee onboarding and training can be just as effective as the traditional method. In fact, I think it can be more. With a few added benefits the old way doesn't offer. And depending on what happens with COVID-19, it might just be the new way forward for everybody. So some of the things that you need to have for your new employees in order to build that onboarding process and the training are new policies and procedures. And these are policies that are around around COVID-19. For any of you who were on my presentation last week, we may have covered some of this, but I want to go into it in a little bit more detail. So how to create an effective COVID-19 workplace policy. We're going to talk about some of the questions and things you have to do to assess your workplace to determine what procedures you have to have in place. So one of the things you have to do, and I've mentioned this already this evening, is conduct a risk evaluation. So you have to assess the risk in your organization in order to determine what policies you need, what procedures you need, what personal protective equipment you need if you can't eliminate the risk. So that is the idea behind having PPE, is if you can't eliminate the risk, you have to provide things like gloves and masks and the dividers and different things if you can't remove the risks. So what is the demographic of your workforce and clientele? Are they considered high risk? What is the demographic in the local community? So depending on where you live as to how high that risk will be. What type of services you provide. Do your employees have access to occupational health and safety services, including personal protective equipment on site? Does your workplace require travel? What is the potential of contracting an infectious disease such as COVID-19? So those are some of the questions you would need to ask to determine what procedures you have in place. So for example, looking at the question, does your workplace require travel? So if you have people that are traveling to do work, they could be delivering, they could be picking up supplies, it could be a number of things that they're traveling for. If they're leaving the workplace and going somewhere else, does it pose a greater risk for them in coming into contact with somebody that has COVID-19? So that you have to assess and determine the risks. The type of services that you provide, the size of the community you live in. So for example, living in Guelph, we probably have a higher risk of coming into contact with COVID-19 than somebody who lives in a more rural setting, because the statistics have shown the higher the population, the greater number of cases per population. Your communication with your team. What do your staff and customers know about COVID-19? Are they aware of the measures you have taken for prevention? So it is important that your clients and your employees know what you are doing to protect them from coming into contact with somebody who has COVID-19. Do you have information and technology required for efficient workplace communications with your workforce? This may be if somebody has worked with, notifying that employee and notifying the customers that came in that day if you have access to that information. So for example, I went into Shoppers about a month ago, and because I used my points card, they knew I was there that day. And apparently a customer had been in the store, reported back to the store that they had been diagnosed with COVID-19 that day. Whether I was in the store at the same time as them or not, I don't know. And whether I was around that customer, I don't know. But they had reported they had been in there. So they notified everybody who had been in the store that day that you potentially may have come in contact with somebody who had been diagnosed with COVID-19. That type of information, if you have that ability, are things that people are doing. The other thing is letting your employees know what your COVID-19 plan is so that they feel safe coming to work. Hygiene, creating effective hygiene policies is really important. So you need to evaluate the workplace for areas where people have frequent contact with each other and shared spaces and objects, and increase the frequency of cleaning in those areas. It may be in lunchrooms, at bathrooms, counters, different things like that. Have you provided the necessary facilities and cleaning products to maintain and clean and safe workplace? So hand washing facilities, hand sanitizing dispensers, personal protective equipment, Lysol wipes, that type of thing to wipe things down. Reduce social contact. So have you considered the feasibility of teleworking arrangements, flexible hours, staggering start times, use of email and teleconferencing? Is working from home viable? Not in all organizations. Is it possible? There may be some of your positions that can. Can you minimize the interactions between customers and your employees, such as limiting the number of customers permitted in your establishment at one time, or serving your customers virtually or by phone when possible, or having curbside pickup? Can you institute measures to ensure your employees are social distancing in the workplace? And have you placed restrictions on allowing visitors to your workplace? And those restrictions may not be stopping them from coming to your workplace, but what restrictions are in place to ensure, and I don't like the word social distancing, and I notice the government starting to use physical distancing more than social, because social distancing implies that we can't socialize with people. And we need, as human beings, we need that social interaction. And that is why the number of mental health issues have risen drastically, and the phones are going crazy at any of our support places in Ontario, because social distancing is something that people have been doing, and they need to be in contact with others by either by Zoom or by phone, or getting outside and talking across a street, or however you're doing that, or even in a workplace, being able to communicate with each other and being social, but at a physical distance. So that's something to remember. It's the physical distance that we're having to do. Travel, we talked about this a little bit. Can you include measures that restrict business travel, or are there ways to put measures in place if they do have to travel within the community or just outside? And this is more for when people were traveling prior to, so they may have been coming back from vacations and everything else, or if they had to travel for work. But some of those restrictions are going to be lifted. And when we go into the second wave of the pandemic, we're going to be back into this situation if they open the borders. So reporting, when and to whom should an employee report their symptoms or exposure to COVID-19, and how should the employee report their symptoms of exposure? You need to let your employees know and have a good process in place. And you need to know when you need to let other employees know that somebody has COVID-19, or that they're going off because they may have potentially come in contact with somebody, so they're going into self-isolation because of it, so they can make sure that they have their incubation period. So the self-isolation, so for how long are employees required to self-isolate? We know it's 14 days, but that depends on the situation as well. So, for example, we have a client who they had an employee who was working at their church. They were physically distancing. They were practicing proper social distancing, physical distancing, and the priest of the church became ill. He went and had some testing done. I am not sure whether he tested positive or not. I have not spoken to the client, but the employee self-isolated for a few days until they found out whether or not the priest tested positive. If he had tested negative for it, then she would have been returning to work. So these are things that you need to have documented so that you know when they can return to work. As far as a medical certificate before they return, right now you cannot get a medical certificate. You are not supposed to ask for a medical certificate. So I put this question in here because we get asked this all the time. Will you require a certificate before they return? No, you will not. You cannot ask for one right now. If they go into isolation for the 14 days and they don't test positive in those 14 days, they need to be getting back to you. But that's something else you need to have in your procedures as well. You need to let your employees know that at the end of the 14-day isolation period and throughout that the 14 days, they need to stay in contact with you to let you know how they're feeling and whether they're returning to work after the 14 days. And if they're not, why they're not. Like, do they have COVID-19 now, so they're staying home? What are the reasons they're not coming back to work? They need to let you know. You shouldn't have to chase after them. They have a responsibility to let you know and to let you know they'll be back after that 14 days on their regular scheduled shift. Specific policies that you need to have in place and that Ministry of Labor are looking for. You will need an infectious disease emergency leave policy. The outlines for this policy are now on the Employment Standards website, so you can have a look at that. An infectious disease workplace protocol outlining social distancing in the workplace, physical distancing, how to service clients and customers. Essential services policy, if you are one, outlining to your team that you are an essential service, what classification you are. Should they get pulled over on their way into work, which people have been, especially if they're traveling at nighttime, that they need to have a letter from you stating that they work for an essential service, what they do and where they work, and their hours of work. First aid emergency procedures updated with the new protocols and a risk management plan, policy and procedures around the pandemic procedures for COVID-19. Existing policies that need to be updated are things like your good health policies, absence policies, employee assistance programs. Have a look at them to and encourage your employees to utilize them for mental health. Working from home policies, if you have people working from home, telecommuting policies, other leave policies that you may have. Review your contracts with staff and for your suppliers and subcontractors, especially your suppliers. If you're having to make changes to your supplier contracts because maybe at this time you don't need to utilize them, you need to have an exit clause in there for such things as pandemic or natural disasters. Review your insurance coverage to see if you have coverage for loss of revenue, loss of business for a pandemic. Most policies don't have that, but some do. Training programs for your teams, you're going to have to update your health and safety training and your workplace training on your new programs that you have in place for this. Other policies and plans to put in place, you will need, in addition to updating other policies and procedures and creating new ones, an emergency response and pandemic plan and policies for future waves of the COVID-19. So make sure you do some planning, and this is on your operations, on your business. Make sure you have those business continuity plans in place. Use this, the past 2 months, as sort of an outline, prototype as to what you're going to do in the next wave and potentially a third wave, and utilize and check that plan every year to make sure it still fits with your organizational needs. The other thing you need to do is assess how you run your business, how you market it, how you interact with your clients moving forward. This will provide you with guidance on other policies, procedures, and training you need to create. This will also prepare you for you to ramp up and reopen parts of your organization that maybe you're not running to its full extent at the moment. And that's the end of the presentation. If there are other questions, I'd be glad to take it right now.
So Lynn, there is one question. So is it 6 feet or PPE or not necessarily both?
It's still 6 feet unless you can't. So for example, if you have a cash register, a till, as you know, when you're going through the cash, there hasn't been the 6 feet. There isn't 6 feet of room between the cashier and you paying for your paying. But if you've been to places like Costco, and there are things you can do. So somebody else, if you have a cart, can empty that cart and you're asked to stand back. But most farm stores aren't big enough to do what they do at Costco. So the plexiglass can be put up where you put the product on the counter and you slide it underneath the counter, or they pull it from underneath the counter to scan it and then bag it and pass it to you at the other end. If you cannot eliminate the risk, you have to provide protective, not only equipment, but it might be protective equipment and PPE. But if they are 6 feet apart, the ministry, and speaking to the Ministry of Labor, because being human beings as we are, we tend to sometimes forget, they are looking that PPE still be provided. Whether they will enforce that, I don't know. Best practice is 6 feet and the PPE, especially while we're still in the height of the pandemic. Are there any other questions?
Yes, there is another question.
Any tips on how to assure employees who are happy to work together when a new unknown person starts employment at your farm? It's always difficult, and Krysta, maybe you can help with this one too, working, because Krysta works a lot with our clients on site at in the farm sector. But it's always difficult bringing somebody new into an organization and having them welcome, especially right now during a pandemic, because everyone's always worried as to where that person's been. And I think the most important thing to do is your screening process that you do prior to that person coming into the organization to identify if they have, if they are high risk. So and reassuring your team of what your process is. So have them know the screening process you go through when somebody has been offered the position, or if they're coming in for those face-to-face interviews. Let them know what the process is and the screening process is to ensure their safety and bringing somebody new in or bringing somebody in for that interview. They need to know, that's why I talked about, they need to know your processes and your protocols, because you're keeping them informed on the safety measures you're putting in place to protect them. Do you have anything else, Krysta?
Yep, there's two questions in the Q&A. So what recommendations do you have for us around recommendations for staff around their travel community exposure on their own time, especially if they are working part-time for 2 or more different businesses, working with the public, etc. Asking about their exposure when they are not on the clock for us, and is it a risk to our staff and customers when can we ask, what can we and what should we recommend?
So every time an employee comes to work right now, you can ask them the COVID-19 questions about where they have they come in contact with anyone with COVID-19? You can ask them those basic questions we provided to you earlier, and we will provide the PDF of the PowerPoint for Kathy to share with you as well. But you can ask those COVID-19 questions whenever somebody comes to work to make sure that you are providing the proper screening process. Like I said, some organizations have implemented the temperature check. Initially, they weren't allowing employers to do the temperature check because they said it had to be conducted by somebody who is qualified. That would be a nurse practitioner, PSW. And most organizations don't have a nurse practitioner or a PSW on staff. Since then, several organizations have implemented. I don't know if you are aware that like Longo's and Guelph and a few others are taking your temperature before you enter the store. There is some potential risk of this being a personal information being medical information, you having access to that, which we're not allowed to have. But they are saying with COVID-19, because of the risks and the severity of the disease, that they are allowing employers to know more information than you typically would know. So that is another way you can do things if you want to do the temperature check or if you want to ask those questions or both. And that would be my recommendation.
Okay, and the other question, Lynn, is in your example of the drugstore contacting you after the customer tested positive, do you think we need to be planning for obtaining all customer emails or phone numbers in case of customer testing positive? Would that be best practice?
Again, it's confidential information, and not everybody coming into your store will want to give you that information. So Ministry of Labor would say, yes, you need to do that. The Privacy Commissioner and Human Rights would probably say that's against their human rights and you can't ask for that because it's private. One thing you could do is if you have that marshal guiding people into your farm stores, so that is something that's recommended. You have somebody who's limiting the number of people coming in, and when that person is outside and they ask those questions about, have they been in contact with somebody, have they traveled, all of those basic questions that you typically ask. They could ask if you'd like to give your email so that, I don't know if you have a newsletter or something that you send out, but to keep you up to date on what's happening in our specials. And then you have that information. But they may not give it to you. No, but it does run the risk of privacy as far as asking for their email and things like that. But you could ask so you know who's in the store, what their name is. But that would be a lot of work for someone to do that as well. So unless you have a points plan or something that they use similar to Shoppers, it would be really hard to track that.
And for small organizations too, that's that extra person that you're going to have to employ or give hours to in order to do that. So that's not always an easy thing to do as well. So some of my recommendations to some of my clients were, if you are contacted stating that somebody was in your store and does have COVID-19, if you have a website or communication newsletter or anything like that, they have been communicating it that way. Just because when you have a small organization, it's really hard to, one, have an extra person on staff and have to pay them to stand there and take everybody's information. Second, it is a privacy concern, as Lynn mentioned. So just having that other communication would be sufficient enough, and having it posted on your Facebook or your website to communicate that out to the public.
Any other questions?
I don't see any at the moment, but if anybody does have any other questions, you can feel free to email us as well. Our email is up on the screen, and we'd be happy to answer your questions at any time.
So the HR at Beyond Rewards goes to all four of us at the organization, so we all get that email, and so you should be able to reach any one of us at any time. And just so you know, right now, through my HR coach, I'm also an senior HR coach, so I coach managers and owners on their role in HR, because most of you do HR every day as owners, and so I do that. And right now, to help you through this stressful time, I am, for the month of May, providing a quarter hour of mental health coaching, if you want to call it that, on, you're stressed and you don't know what to do, you have a quick question, you can reach out to me, and you can email me. I forgot to put it on here, but lynn@thehrcoach.ca, and it'll go through that part of our department, and I will do a quarter of an hour a week for the next 4 weeks with you if you have questions, at no charge.
There is one last question there. Do you want to
Sure. Yeah.
address that one as well, and then we can wrap things
Let
up?
me see if I can see it.
It's under the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Example of a drugstore?
No, so it says, what are the requirements for distancing for outdoor agritourism farms? Is it 36 feet per person for 20 or 50 people?
So outdoors, they haven't given less restrictions than indoors. So it is still 6 feet per person. And so it would be the 36 feet for outdoors. They have not lifted any of those restrictions that I am aware of to make it any less at this time.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Lynn, Krysta, and Pat. We really appreciate your information this evening. I did send out information about the other webinars that Beyond Rewards HR is doing. It was in the email blast that went out last week, but I'll post them again so you have all the titles and the dates in the members only Facebook page either tonight or tomorrow morning. So look for them there if you're looking for some other information. And that's it for this evening. Thanks again, folks, for coming out and for listening and for sharing. We'll see you next Monday.
Thank you.